Hello, everyone. My name is Shahen De Silva, and I'm with founder executive director Dr. Pakiso Tisaravanamuttu to talk about the developing India Pakistan conflict happening right on our doorstep. Dr. Sara, any opening remarks before beginning?
Well, I guess the situation, the escalation is continuing, but one hopes that the escalation will be contained because, of course, these are two nuclear powers. And I suspect, though, that the escalation is largely directed at domestic audiences to, assuage the popular frustrations and anger and all of that kind of thing. Hopefully, it will be contained.
Of course. I think one place I'd like to start at is on a more general basis, we see that there are allegations that this horrific terrorist attack that happened on April 22nd, India alleges that it was done by a rebel group connected to Pakistan. Pakistan claims that there is no such connection and that they themselves also refute that any such attack should have taken place and that it is horrific what we witnessed. But regardless of the lack of concrete evidence given by India, and there being an escalation of the conflict regardless of that connection between the TRF and Pakistan, this further escalation, does it signify a hollowing out of international rules and norms where we have benefit of the doubt and a love for action to proceed from credible evidence? What do you think?
Well, yes, I think we're living in a world in which that whole notion of rules of international law have been challenged to the extent that I think there's a sort of notion that, look, we know that this is an attack from such and such a country. We don't need to look at international law and go through a due process. We need to act. We need to react. And I think that is something that has perhaps become fairly pervasive now, from Ukraine to Gaza to wherever else. But with regard to India and Pakistan, of course, this is a long-standing rivalry, feud, conflict dating from 1947, an independence where a Hindu Maharaja signed the Treaty of Accession for a state which was largely Muslim. Now, India is kind of capitalizing on a notion that Pakistan harbors terrorists or armed groups that have a stake or have got involved in Afghanistan, and that definitely with regard to Kashmir, they are involved in provocation. But as you say, I think they need to show the hard evidence of the link between the two, but they are sort of trading on the public perception that invariably Pakistan, if it did not know that the attack was going to take place on such and such a date, that Pakistan provides sanctuary, provides nurture, succors these groups in order that they can do what they did on the 22nd of April. So, whilst I think it is, appropriate that the evidence is put out there very clearly so that the sort of moral legitimacy, if you like, of that action is fulfilled, I think this is also largely being done to assuage public opinion. And if you look at the media, for example, in India, they're all infuriated by what has happened, and they're all sort of very much behind the government to support this, what Operation Sindoor or whatever it is being called. And I think that is part of the general sort of raising of the climate of tension in order to get political support of one, or in order to consolidate political support of one kind or another. Now, what one hopes, of course, is that having done that, they recognize that they're also caught up in a relationship of deterrence and that they can't push too far, that both sides have to be able to reach a point at which they satisfy their domestic audience that they've taken sufficient action and then let it cool down. Because, nuclear deterrence is a very risky thing insofar as you put one step wrong and then the escalation can continue to a point at which you have no control. And that's what we need to avoid, so that you satisfy the domestic political audience that you have taken sufficient steps and then you cool off.
Absolutely. I'm in complete agreement. There is a lot of appeasement of the domestic constituency that we can see. I mean, even if we take Operation Sindoor, as you mentioned, I mean, just the name Sindoor is very symbolic in that it is the name for the vermilion pigment that married women wear
When they've lost someone.
when they've lost someone, and it's to sort of signify the widowed women from this April 22nd attack. So it's very charged along these historic rivalry that these two countries have, and it's very much rhetoric before evidence, and that is something that ideally we would not like to see when we think about the rules of the game on the international stage, that being international rules and norms, and how it applies to the audience listening in, that we'd like to see an independent, neutral investigation into the attacks and to see the legitimacy of due process come in so that we avoid unnecessary casualties, unnecessary tension, and strengthen the regional stability of South Asia, which is very important not only to Indians and Pakistanis, to Sri Lankans as well, and the rest of South Asia. And we also have to note that while there is blows being traded, there is also an information war that is taking place. If we look at Indian media versus Pakistani media, there is a serious difference, regarding developments. For example, India states that Operation Sindoor purely targeted terrorist infrastructure. Pakistan says that there were
Civilians.
31 or so civil casualties from it, drone attacks being mentioned by one side, and the other side saying there was no such attacks. So there is very much serious media polarization that's also playing into the rhetoric and narrative of this conflict. And that's something, the audience also needs to be mindful of when they're consuming media with regard to this conflict, that you have to really see where you are getting this information from, because it is such a polarized media environment.
But I think, with regard to the media thing, both sides are really sort of ratcheting up their invective and whatever, and the false media, the fake news and all of that has reached quite considerable levels. But, as far as this is done largely for the public. And so as far as the public is concerned, they've taken sides already. And this is just, in a sense, almost like trading insults, So I don't think you can really stop that as such. I mean, for example, there was this whole suggestion that an Indian general was forced out, and that he has now come up with a bombshell saying that India actually did conspire and create this incident and all of that kind of thing. So, I think once the political leadership ratchet down their invective, then the thing will cool down. Because after all, I mean, between India and Pakistan, there have been incidents in the past which have been contained, and these are also incidents that have happened after both sides became nuclear powers. But the problem here is that the hostility in the region is being sustained. there is nothing being done to reduce that hostility. And as you pointed out, there are the Chinese, the Americans, there's the whole Quad number against China. There is a heightened sense of competition between regional and extra-regional powers for influence in this area. And one hopes that there will be some sanity that prevails and this will be brought down. But as to who is going to be able to intervene, to mediate, to bring these things down to a much more manageable and responsible level is a big question mark. Now, in the past, when Mrs. Bandaranaike was in power in the 1960s and then in the 1970s, Sri Lanka had a robust and well-regarded foreign policy whereby we could present ourselves as some kind of mediator. At the same time, because we were a non-aligned country and a strong member of that movement, we were able to turn around and tell the Indians, for example, in 1971, that we were allowing Pakistani planes to come and refuel in the context of the Bangladesh War of Liberation. We tried to negotiate with the Indians and the Chinese in the 1960s over their border disputes. But I think for us, at the moment, we're not really in a position to present ourselves as an impartial mediator on the heels of those 7 agreements that we've signed in India, and particularly the defense agreement, which invariably puts us into the Indian camp. And I don't think the Pakistanis would necessarily want to look upon us in that respect as a completely independent actor. At the same time, because this is an old conflict, an old bone of contention, India and Pakistan seem to want to be able to deal with this on their own. And there is an extent to which we can try to insulate the India-Pakistan rivalry over Kashmir from the broader question of regional hegemony, influence, all of that kind of thing. So I think we have to wait and see as to whether the military exchanges are going to continue, as to whether they're going to be ratcheted up. I don't see any evidence that there is further provocation to increase the tensions between the two countries in terms of military action. So hopefully it might die down and be contained at that level. But the diplomatic Cold War will continue.
No, absolutely. Despite that, though, Doctor, I mean, like you said, those are different times. We were much more committed to a non-aligned foreign policy. We didn't have the agreements that we currently do with regard to the India-Sri Lanka Defence Cooperation Agreement that, President Anurukumara Dissanayake and Prime Minister Narendra Modi signed April 4th to 6th. The fact that it pulled us far more into the strategic security calculus of India, at least in this case, definitely much more than of Pakistan, where we have much less relations. We also have many agreements about increasing connectivity between the two countries. So we are far more connected and far more in a relationship of interdependence with India than we are with Pakistan. Despite that, though, like you mentioned with regard to Mrs. Bandaranaike, and we have past examples of, for example, Jayaraj Waldner's role in sort of re-establishing Japan's relationship with the world post-World War II at the San Francisco Peace Treaty Conference. Sri Lanka, despite its, small stature in terms of geographic size, has been able to have an outsized role in foreign policy in the past. And, on the heels of, Vice President J.D. Vance saying that, look, we hope the conflict de-escalates, but it is not our business to get involved. and the lack of other viable mediators in this conflict outside of perhaps Iran from the Pakistani side, is there a role for Sri Lanka to play still in mediating this conflict, despite its strengthened relationship with India, to say, in the interests of regional stability, regional harmony, regional flourishing, that we need to go about this conflict in a different way?
Well, I mean, the thing about Kashmir is that it's a very particular animosity, tension between India and Pakistan, and it has had international repercussions to the extent that the United Nations got involved in it. So I don't think Sri Lanka has a role to play, and that is being reinforced by our movement more towards the Indian camp. But I noticed that I think was yesterday, the government of Sri Lanka said that we would not do anything that would be seen as being leaning to one side or the other, both in terms of diplomatically and in terms of the military dimension. So I think, the attitude is, look, it's between the two of them. As long as it remains between the two of them, fine. We'd like it not to be the case, but nevertheless, it's to be contained between the two of them and contained in terms of not resulting in any threat of nuclear retaliation by one side or the other. So, I mean, it's a kind of thing almost to say that, look, yeah, we have to live with this,
Okay.
as long as it is contained within these current bounds.
On that note, I suppose projecting towards the future, Sri Lanka, one of Sri Lanka's paths to economic prosperity has been through increasing economic integration between itself and India. There were talks of land connectivity over the Hawk Strait that have now, for the time being,
Put on hold.
put on hold. There have always been talks of, and very viable strategies of, Sri Lanka being what Singapore is to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, being a sort of gateway or hub, particularly through robust port logistics, and having that kind of relationship, utilizing its strategic geographic location. And of course, given that India is the real economic powerhouse of South Asia, particularly the southern Indian states, and leveraging that connectivity, does this add another sort of layer of complexity, or maybe another, con with regard to using that increased connectivity, particularly to the south of India, as a way to grow economically, to come out of the economic precarity that we have been in? Because we end up being in a more economically interdependent or maybe dependent relationship with India the more we do that. And what does that mean for future instances of regional instability in South Asia, where we may have to lean towards India just by virtue of, the state of our economic affairs?
Well, I think, even if you put the agreements that have been made or MOUs or whatever aside, for Sri Lanka, in terms of its position in this region, etc., I think all governments have realized that they can't do anything or shouldn't do anything in terms of foreign policy that would be perceived by India as inimical to its interests. And so in that respect, leaving aside the arguments about economic interdependence, etc., I think at the end of the day, we have to align ourselves with Indian interests, whether we do so explicitly or implicitly, that is a different question in a sense. But I don't see us being able to move out of India's shadow, if you like.
Yeah. And I suppose in this situation, just sort of to insert ourselves into the debate about increasing connectivity with India, what does it mean for sovereignty and whatnot? There are different there are different issues that we're trying to solve in
Oh,
this
yes.
particular case.
Oh, yeah.
And we have to sort of ask ourselves, what are we prioritizing for?
No, this is the point. I mean, in the Indian case, the soft power, the economic dimension, is obviously going to take greater precedence. And I think, I mean, although one doesn't like to talk about inevitability as far as international politics is concerned, I would think that if India does take off, it would be ridiculous for Sri Lanka to turn its back on it, because whatever the organization and association is for South Asia, India is going to be the dominant player. So the questions that we have to face, I think, is in terms of our domestic politics as to whether we're going to be able to accept that we are going to be part of India in terms of the economic interdependence argument, and as to whether the rest of Sri Lanka, apart from the north and east, which invariably will get caught up in this, is going to turn its back and say, no, we're not going to have anything to do with it. And I think that would be really quite absurd. We have to therefore come up with a strategic vision for our foreign policy rather than get dragged into the economic sphere of India on an ad hoc basis.
By force.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it is a case of either we try to avoid the situation altogether and lose out on the upside that is leveraging that connectivity for our own economic prosperity because of the serious upside there is to the economic strength of India, and to take measures to mitigate the risks to our own sovereignty and whatnot, right? So in that case, I mean, further connectivity, in my view, is very viable for Sri Lanka. And that is something that we really need to consider. Even questions of land connectivity, even though they're on pause, they must still be considered seriously without purely thinking about us being sort of captured by
Yeah,
India
it
in
should
some
not
sense.
be, yes, it should not be a blank refusal of it. It should rather be ways looking for constructive ways in which we can engage in that relationship, but at the same time
maintain our sovereignty.
Yeah.
And that's through different means. For example, military restructuring and optimizing the strength of the military in a way that isn't currently happening and whatnot, right? To deter that kind of, that potential threat,
Yeah.
right? And in that sense, this is definitely something to consider because this conflict reminds us that South Asian stability isn't set in stone.
No, and that into the future, in terms of regions of the world that are going to be of increasing importance, and unfortunately perhaps of greater tension, South Asia is certainly up there.
Absolutely. Another element that I think might be interesting to discuss, particularly for Sri Lankans and the audience, is how does China stand to gain from sustained Indo-Pakistan tensions? We have to understand that Pakistan is a close ally of China and has supported Pakistan in many previous encounters. And of course, that India is a regional competitor to China. And how does this affect Sri Lanka, given these major powers jostle for influence in Sri Lanka, given its strategic position in the Indian Ocean? Any thoughts on that dimension?
Well, I suppose to the extent that China is a very close ally of Pakistan, and there are clashes between India and China on their borders. I suppose the idea the Chinese could well kind of be provocative in terms of, yes, there could be further border skirmishes with regard to India on their borders. They could try to be more provocative as far as their economic relations in Sri Lanka are concerned. But again, I think it is within the bounds of a containment strategy of not allowing this conflict to blow up. You know, so in a sense, I mean, what we have between India and China, and yes, you bring the Pakistanis into it on the side of the Chinese, is that we've now come to accept that there is a kind of Cold War. Now, the point about a Cold War, of course, is that a Cold War is about competition, but not confrontation and conflict. You know, so there are intuitive, if not explicit at times, boundaries beyond which it should not go or cannot go. But as I said, I mean, in the current situation, international rules and all of that seem to be disregarded. But I think here in this part of the world, there is a recognition, though, that yes, this is the only part of the world where there are two superpowers, you know, as neighbors, as it were, in terms of nuclear power, and one has to be therefore a lot more responsible and restrained.
Agreed. China stands to benefit strategically from these sustained tensions, but there is a ceiling on those tensions beyond which they would not. For example, if it escalated even further, if the conflict escalated well beyond those bounds to, you know, potentially a full-scale confrontation.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, of course, is that their military hardware is being used, and therefore this is a testing ground, if you like, for their military hardware.
Well, of course, you know, what Sri Lankans and the audience listening in might be interested in is India's, if there are sustained tensions below a certain threshold, it may tie down India's capacity and the resources it has to sort of continue to develop its regional image, its regional assertiveness, particularly in Sri Lanka, because it is focused on this, that, you know, on the backs of it, China may be able to take advantage of if, you know, there are these sort of hawkish interpretations of the conflict, because we also see that, you know, even with regard to the defense cooperation agreement between India and Sri Lanka, there is potential for China to want to also have its own bilateral agreements with Sri Lanka of a similar nature. And that is something that, you know, Sri Lanka's foreign policy must be wary of, that it must be able to sort of make these strategic calculations as to how foreign actors may be trying to shape its own policy, its own foreign policy, and therefore its domestic politics.
Yeah, we badly need, in that respect, that foreign policy strategy, because if we are going to sort of allow ourselves to be used, as it were, by both India and China and keep constantly balancing the two in terms of their influence in Sri Lanka by giving X a certain amount of leeway and Y a certain amount of leeway, I think we need to do it in such a way that, look, we impress two things, no? That we want to be friendly with both sides. At the same time, we are wanting to do that without compromising our sovereignty. And I think that requires a lot more consideration and thought than has hitherto gone into our foreign policy.
I think what we can sort of take away from this conversation, if you will, is what does this conflict signify for the South Asian region and naturally for Sri Lankans, is that South Asian regional stability is not a foregone conclusion. It is still something that is developing. That instability may continue well into the future beyond this conflict as well. Sri Lanka needs to be able to navigate that in such a way where it does not compromise its sovereignty and allow itself to be dragged onto one side versus the other.
Yeah.
But we also need to recognize that India is now an economic powerhouse of the region, particularly the southern Indian states, and that there are serious advantages for Sri Lanka's economic prosperity by Sri Lanka leveraging that. And it has to do that in a very strategic way where it does not compromise what we were talking about earlier, which is its integrity, territorial integrity, its sovereignty, and whatnot. So these questions, these debates around connectivity must not be completely overshadowed by concerns of, being caught up in the
Absolutely.
Indian sphere and, sort of becoming part of India or anything like that. I mean, those are too hawkish, too narrow-minded, and we need to understand that, there are things that we need to optimize for, particularly, right? While balancing our sovereignty, we need to understand that this is a country that's recovering from an economic crisis. Economic prosperity is something that each and every one of us wants, and that this event is just another part of the equation that is Sri Lanka's strategic maneuvering of its sovereignty and economic prosperity.
No, and also, we have to look into the future in which, for example, the Adanis are going to build a port in South India. Transshipment is going to be affected by that. What's up? 70% of the transshipment to India is through the port.
Well, they've actually already built it.
Well, and the Maldives is talking about creating a financial hub in Mali. So these are two things that we have identified as wanting to become the
And that we now
port
have
city.
competitors for.
And we have serious competitors now.
Absolutely. We can't afford to sort of miss the bus,
Absolutely.
right? If we really want to develop the efficiency of our ports, have robust port logistics that allow us to prosper by being a gateway to South Asia, because perhaps while everyone was waiting on us to do this, others have decided to take matters into their own hands, particularly the port that is now in Kerala, in India. And still, despite us being very late to the party, we still have the geographical advantage, and we have a head start in port logistics. And the time is now, if we really want to
Absolutely.
bank on that as an advantage, to become something like what Singapore is to Southeast Asia. Not to catch up economically, of course, but to sort of leverage our version, our contextualized version of that strategy in order to economically prosper.
Yeah, I think, given the pace of events all over the world and in South Asia in particular as well, governments have to realize that they need to hit the road running. They have to have a strategy. They can't spend too much time instead of saying, look, yeah, we're in committee, we're in consultation, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, the other aspect is that some of these policies have been thought about already for many decades, but still have yet to
not
be
been,
in
yes.
implementation.
Yeah.
I mean, this particular port strategy that we're talking about has been in conversation for decades, and it still remains in conversations and not in action.
Not, yes. Yeah.
And the time is now, and there probably will potentially never be another time for us to leverage this opportunity because others have decided to take matters into their own hands.
Yeah. We can't afford to miss the bus again.